Good afternoon, everyone. I want to say, I'm Garnet Stokes, UNM president. I want to say thank you very much to everyone who is joining us today for this critical conversation. Looking around, well, virtually at least, I can see we've got the right people in the room to both talk to you and listen to you when it comes to safety on our campus. And I'm looking forward to an informative and a respectful afternoon. I want to be sure you know that I've heard the calls for action in response to the experiences with racism and social injustice in our community. Many have asked, rightly, how can we reconcile a police presence on campus with our need to ensure the exchange of free speech and free expression of ideas? Others have questioned what the most appropriate role of the police might be in a campus environment, and what behaviors, procedures, and protocols may need to be modified to suit an evolving campus culture. As you may know, the University of New Mexico will be hiring a new chief of police. This provides us with an ideal opportunity to do some of this reflection and self-examination, and to engage in a very public and inclusive dialogue about safety in a campus environment. I'm grateful we have Interim Chief Silva here today as part of the conversation to discuss UNMPD's relationship with both the campus community and outside law enforcement agencies. I mention outside agencies because I know that earlier this spring, some of our students were frightened by the presence of state police on the roofs of campus buildings. While external law enforcement did access our facilities with the intention of keeping our community safe, I know that for many, it doesn't look or feel that way at all. That's why it's critical that we work closely with external law enforcement to ensure that our campus values are upheld and that thoughtful consideration is given to any real or perceived show of force that may create fear among members of our community. Safety on our campus is not a new issue. It was top of mind for the campus community when I interviewed for the job of president. And when I had the privilege of coming here, I made campus safety one of my very first priorities. So the issue isn't new, but the nuances are most certainly changing. The way we perceive law enforcement and their relationship with our communities and our campus is changing. It's vital that we lean into that change. We also face some unique challenges in that we are an urban campus. That means we have obligations and responsibilities to our campus, but it also means that it impacts surrounding neighborhoods, and the neighborhoods themselves impact us. So as part of our conversation today, I want to ensure a meaningful discussion of public safety and police enforcement, both in and around an urban university campus. I'm also empathetic to the view that we as a society are over-policed. Our student body is one of the most diverse in the nation, and they bring with them varying experiences with and perceptions of law enforcement. I think it's vital that our officers understand and appreciate how our students perceive them, and that cultural biases are real and can really matter. To that end, it's critical to note that perception does matter. Several weeks ago, we were made aware of what appeared to be a racially tinged social media posting by one of our UNMPD officers. And that posting did concern many members of our community. Because respect and diversity are an integral part of our campus culture, we immediately launched an investigation, which has been concluded and disciplinary action has been taken. The officer remains employed with UNMPD. But even amid the calls for either drastically reducing or completely eliminating police on campus, we must approach this conversation critically and fairly for all members of our Lobo community. And that includes our police officers. You may know that there was a robbery on campus earlier this month in broad daylight before noon. This is a very frightening experience, not only for the student who was robbed, but for anyone who lives, walks, works, or takes classes on our campus. And I know I probably don't need to remind you that I live on campus too. And certainly we, my husband and I, want to feel safe living here and safe in walking throughout the campus, which we do really every day at different times of day. So today then, we'll discuss both the perception and the reality of policing and public safety on our campus and in our community, and how we keep everyone safe responsibly, compassionately, and respectfully. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. Thank you very much to Dr. Zarai and her team for putting together this very critical forum for UNM. And now I intend to stop speaking and start listening. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, President Stokes. We just are so pleased about your leadership at UNM and that you're always creating spaces for dialogue and for listening. So thank you so much for that. Now I would like to turn things over to Frankie Flores, who is the director of the LGBTQ Resource Center, and they will start off by reading the land acknowledgement.
Thank you, Dr. Zarai. Founded in 1889, the University of New Mexico sits on the traditional homelands of the Pueblo of Sandia, the original peoples of New Mexico, Pueblo, Navajo, and Apache, since time immemorial, have deep connections to the land and have made significant contributions to the broader community statewide. We honor the land itself and those who remain stewards of this land throughout the generations, and also acknowledge our committed relationship to Indigenous peoples. We gratefully recognize our history. All right, so we are going to begin our fireside chat with other directors from resource centers. We're going to have Armando Bustamante. We will also have Pamagoyo and Brandy Stone. Welcome, everyone.
I'll just interrupt and also introduce Rosa Cervantes.
Oh, my apologies, Rosa Cervantes. Rosa, don't get mad at me. So I think it's really important that we have a discussion as those of us who are frontline staff members, right? And we deal with students on a day-to-day basis on some of the concerns that we know our students have raised and that we also see here on campus. So I kind of wanted to talk first off about the history of law enforcement in the United States, because I think that that's often a history that is not known. And I think that it's important to acknowledge that, like, beginning, right, of that historical trauma with police, and maybe we can just move into a conversation from there. So as some of us may know, the current U.S. police system that we have is was founded in slavery and in capturing slaves across the South and the North. And so that has created this precedence, right, of a distrust of police officers. And we know that, you know, as far as LGBTQ folks, right, we were historically, we were treated as though we were mentally ill and that we were criminalized for a very long time. You know, my existence, my being here, you know, in makeup would have been worthy of arrest. And so that historical fear of being my holistic self, of being my whole self, is something that I still carry with me, you know, and I think about that every time I am out, every time I am flying. Anything that I'm doing reminds me that because of how I look, because of who I am criminalized. And so I think I want to start there, and I want to hear other people's thoughts, other people's experiences.
Thank you, Frankie, and thank you for having us in this conversation. I want to say that while it's important to recognize that, you know, the South and the slave patrols is the early establishment of law enforcement, it's also important. There's two other things that I think are also very important when we think about the trauma towards our community, and that is after slavery and the 13th Amendment, it abolishes slavery except as punishment for crime, right? And so if all we need to do is continue to make people criminals to continue a slave system, then there's some trauma there. And then I also want to talk about, so many people say, well, that happened in the South, the North was free, et cetera, et cetera. And so I also just want to share that when we look at the Great Migration and these Black families and communities moving north in hopes that, you know, there's a new start, where they're also met with this law enforcement that is enacting residential segregation, right? Like, we don't want you here. We don't want you in our communities. Don't uproot our whiteness. And so I just want to share that it's important to also recognize that it wasn't just happening in the South, that it was also happening in this like free, romanticized North as well.
Thank you so much for that, Brandy. Pam or Rosa, do you want to chime in about the communities that we serve, right, in the fear, right, of police and law enforcement?
Sure. Well, this is a challenging conversation to have. I have to open up with that because I think it's important to acknowledge the fact that it is uncomfortable. We recognize that we have communities of color serving in law enforcement, and then we also recognize how many of our communities are uncomfortable with law enforcement. And so it's balancing those things and trying to understand kind of where different folks are coming from. I think to add to the convolutedness of, if you will, of how police was created and started, in terms of Latino communities, I think more than just Latino communities, but we do see it a lot in Latino communities. It's also looking at the conversation around immigration and how law enforcement does or doesn't work with immigration and with ICE. And so there comes another fear factor that I think is thrown in there on whether or not folks will be connected to immigration, whether or not they're US citizens, right? So we have a lot of US citizens who have families with mixed status backgrounds. And so they not only don't want to be questioned themselves, they don't want to be questioned about the families whom they come from. And so there's another layer of trauma that I think gets thrown in there, and that complicates the conversation even more.
Absolutely, thank you.
And I guess the only thing that I would add, because I think Brandy and Rosa have framed it quite nicely, but, you know, in particular for Indigenous communities and Indigenous populations, I mean, given the diversity in tribes themselves and given tribal relationships or not with the federal government, that's an additional sort of layer of policing, if you will. And so those things have very rarely been positive interactions because, as you all mostly are, or most people are aware of, just the history and the founding of this country, and the fact that you know, this country was founded through, you know, theft and really erasure of Native people. And so there's that additional element, I think, of the realities of the historical component specific to Native populations.
Yeah, and I think you've all touched on something that I want to expand on. Rosa, you mentioned it, that intersectionality, right, of sometimes the members of our own communities, BIPOC folks, queer folks, are also in law enforcement. And so sometimes there is that struggle of how do we acknowledge that these people are our community, right? But they're also engaging in a system that has disenfranchised a lot of folks. You know, and I think often when I think about the police force, I think about Stonewall a lot, and how so many people do not remember that the reason we celebrate Stonewall is it was a protest against police brutality. And it was also a very intersectional protest. You know, August 28th, 1969 is when police raided, but on the 29th and on the 30th and so on, it was our Latino communities, it was our Black communities. You know, Harlem School Association came out and protested also. And so how do we reconcile, right, this violent and dangerous past and present that we have with the fact that we also have communities who are in this force as well?
I think you bring up an excellent point, Frankie, in terms of talking about intersectionality. From the Latino perspective, I mean, Latinos are of every color, skin color that you can think of. And so when you think about, and they're all of varying degrees of US citizen to undocumented folks, right? And so we have such a diverse community. I think all of our communities diverse, so we can't judge a person by their skin color, the clothes they choose to wear, the car they choose to drive. However, realistically, when you look at social media and you look at what's happening on TV, right, these are the things that are very much blown up, if you will. They're exaggerated in many ways, and then that then spills over into our everyday life. So if you look a certain way or you carry a certain type of clothing, you must act that way. And the truth is that that's not the case, right? You don't know who a person is by looking at their skin color, whatever the skin color is, and you don't know who a person is by the clothes they choose to wear. You may get an idea of kind of some of their style and maybe their musical liking or things like that, but you really don't at the core know who they are. And I think that's where we need to really talk about how do we get beyond that. Just like you cannot look at a police officer and know who they are based on the uniform they're wearing, but we recognize the system that folks are working within. And so when we're talking about police brutality or we're talking about communities feeling uncomfortable, we also have to consider the fact that at the end of the day, we're talking about human beings dealing with a system that we've inherited over hundreds of years, right? And so how do we dismantle those systems to really serve our community and each other, right? And so how do we stop judging each other and move beyond that? And that's a challenging question, a challenging part to do.
I guess I would add, you know, Rosa, I think that you bring up a really great point, because all of those things are very, very true. But aside from that, when you think about our campus community and you think about the history of our own campus community, I think that there is a really significant opportunity to not only educate and re-educate our community, but think about ways in which we can become a stronger community. You know, despite relationships or perceptions about policing out in I'll say in the world outside of the university. You know, as a UNM alum and as an undergraduate, you know, I can remember a time when the police officers were just part of what I would call sort of just daily interaction, and they were part of the scenery of the institution. And so you always saw police officers. I can remember being friends with many officers. They were friendly, they were engaged. You saw them. I don't ever remember feeling threatened, intimidated, afraid, nervous, any of the kinds of things that I think our students now share with us about their experiences. And then as I moved into my professional role within the university, you know, there was a time where the police department was part of the Student Affairs Division. And I think that there were much different values, if you will, and operations with the police, because, you know, they sat amongst us and in our conversations about holistic student development, right? So, better supporting students, the ways in which you engage the student community, providing leadership opportunities for students. So our police department was very much engaged in that work and had voice, and participated in all of those kinds of things. And then we sort of shifted to the police department being, you know, removed from the Division of Student Affairs into where it is now. And I think that that has created significant gaps, not only in communication, but relationship building. Again, this is my personal opinion, but it's also diminished opportunities for more collaborative work and partnerships, and for, I think, all of our campus then to really sort of, you know, continue to build on, I think, really meaningful interactions.
Yeah, absolutely.
Frankie, and if I may chime in, I think it's also understanding that when our students come into campus, they've been seeing this in the media, right? Like they've been seeing the distrust in law enforcement. And I think that just like anybody else on campus, it's up to us to shift that view, right? It's up to us as individuals. It's up to us at El Centro to think about how do we make our presence seen and our students understand that we are there for them. And so I think that that's really important for all of us, including our law enforcement here on campus, to make sure that we build those relationships, that we are the things that Pam mentioned earlier, that Rosa mentioned, right, that Brandy has mentioned, that we are visible, that we are in the spaces interacting with students, and not just because something happened, right? Just because it's nice to get to know somebody. It's a lot easier for me to talk to police officer if I know who they are. It's just, it really truly is. And a lot of the things that have been mentioned are happening and have been happening for a while. And Rosa mentioned about, you know, our immigration stuff. That's policing too, right? And so when our communities think about policing, they don't delineate one police force to another. It's policing, and they're having those interactions that have made them fearful. I remember growing up, both my parents were undocumented, right? They changed their status, but I remember growing up that we were afraid of immigration. We were afraid of La Migra, right? And so those are things that just really are happening in our community, and we need to understand that we need to be proactive in fighting those views, and not just sit back and hope that it changes.
Yeah. You touched on something very important, Armando, because, and you and Rosa both have mentioned this, you know, my experience with law enforcement was very, very different from my sisters. You know, my two oldest sisters are, you know, one of them, their nickname is Guarita. Like she is very white passing. She has light skin, she has green eyes. And so she didn't have that fear that I did, right? She wasn't followed in the store. When I lived in South Carolina, I lived in Charleston, and I was living with my friend at the time, Amber, who was a white woman with green eyes, blonde hair, and driving around with her in her convertible was very uncomfortable. I felt very unsafe, and we got pulled over a number of times and asked who I was and why was I with her. And so, you know, I think that we have to acknowledge that, you know, there is not a universal experience with anybody, and especially with law enforcement. And also, you know, I think that we have that hard position of how do we reconcile, as Rosa mentioned, like the human being, that person who is part of that system. Like, how do we do that as ethnic and resource centers?
Frankie, if I could just share, I think one thing that's important to just like say out loud is community capacity building or community policing. And I also just think language is so important, right? And so when we have officers on campus that sit in their car and drive around or ride on their bike or show up to events but don't say anything, that is more intimidating than just saying, hi, I'm here just checking out what's going on, or hey, how are you doing? And so I think in the past 2 to 3 years, it's felt like officers don't want to talk to students or don't want to talk to staff, but they'll show up in spaces and sit in kind of the backs of spaces, like, you know, crossed arms and watching. And so I think it's also about body language and verbal language. And so I hope that in this conversation that maybe we can build some collaborative opportunities where officers can talk with students so that they can see the personal side of them.
Brandy, you bring up a really great point. We have to recognize that whatever is happening outside of campus, we're gonna see all of those experiences and all of those emotions come to campus. And so if we aren't doing something to create educational spaces where we're learning from one another, there's no way that we can actually change students or families' minds or even faculty and staff's minds, right? Because we're dealing with everything that's outside of campus and then we're seeing it here on campus. So having folks participate in activities, show up. I don't know how many times in the last 2 to 3 years, as Brandy mentioned, I've had students come to my office. There's an event happening outside my window and they come to my office to just inform me, hey, just FYI, you know, UNMPD's here. And I'm like, oh, is something happening? And they're like, no, I just want you to know that they're here so you can keep an eye out. And so students feel like they need to inform us to watch out for them in case something happens. And so that really shouldn't happen, right? And so we recognize that we have to do a better job of inviting our campus police and security to come to events and making them aware of that. But then also when they show up to spaces, that they need to take responsibility to come in, not just stay at the fringes, kind of in wait, right? Which makes it's the body language, like you said, but it's recognizing that we have responsibility to do some things differently and recognize how we have an opportunity to really create a strong learning environment where we can change the landscape, right? And how do then folks go back into their community and act and connect or don't, right? So how do we change that through some of those learning opportunities that we can have here?
Yeah, and you know, we've got a couple of minutes left, so we're going to close out here. But I do want to close out on how, you know, what can we as student service centers provide for PD? And I do want to mention that, you know, we did have one of our police officers engage in our safe zone training this past week. And I think that was a moment of, to me, it was a moment of you are actually, you're walking the walk, right? You're walking your talk. You know, they came in and they volunteered to do the safe zone training so they could unlearn a lot of those biases. So what are some things that we can provide as African American Student Services, American Indian Student Services, and El Centro to help unlearn these biases?
Well, I think first and foremost, I mean, I think, you know, I would like to, and maybe I'm just reminiscing a little too much in what's the current climate of our world and longing for the time when things seemed to be so much more pleasant and just kind of easygoing. I mean, I would like to see actual visible presence of our police officers on campus with smiles on their faces and indicating that they are happy to be part of the community and interested in what people are doing, not necessarily on alert for crime or, you know, just things that maybe have more negative connotations. I mean, I think if we're trying to build community, we actually have to want to be engaged with the community and not just be observers. And I think the same goes with the centers. And I definitely won't speak for all of the centers, but in my center in particular, I think, you know, it is, I'll just be honest and say that it's a little annoying that, you know, folks will only engage our center, for example, when there is a problem that needs to be fixed, and they're hoping that we could sort of intervene and help support that rather than coming from it from a more partnership perspective. And so, I mean, I think there are those opportunities to do that, but unless we take the time to actually get to know each other and spend some quality time knowing the human side, as Rosa mentioned earlier, I don't know that that's ever going to to evolve, because until you actually have some time to know people, you don't then have opportunities to sort of let relationships organically bloom. And that's also, I think, part of creating a community where everyone feels valued, where everyone feels respected, where people feel safe, and also feel the freedom to express their ideas and their perspectives and identities and all the kinds of things that make us all distinct and unique, without reprisal.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I feel like we could have gone on hours and hours, and there's so much more to do, right? The work is never done, so it's job security. But thank you so much to my colleagues, and I will turn it over.
Thank you so much. That was such a great conversation. And Pam, thank you so much for those comments in terms of ways we can build better trust between UNMPD and our students, faculty, and staff. And so now we get an opportunity to listen to our representatives from the UNM Police Department, Chief Silva and Officer Young, who will do some active listening, let us know some of what they've heard from the fireside chat. No fire, it's too hot outside, but still the same idea. And also to give us a sense of ways they see us moving forward in terms of the future of public safety at UNM. So I'd like to turn it over first to Chief Silva.
Thank you. Wonderful reflections from everybody. You know, it kind of gives me flashbacks just a little bit about myself. You know, I've actually traveled around the country talking about diversity and working with communities and organizations and how to build and engage each other. So I thought this was a wonderful exchange. You know, and some of you hit the points, Pamela, I think working together on issues to get to know each other is awesome. You know, because in order to address and resolve issues, we have to exchange dialogue, right? And in other words, you know, we wouldn't go and get a prescription for medication before being seen by a doctor, right? And so the only way that we can learn about some of the things that are going on within our community, within our body, so to speak, is having this exchange of information. And so I think one of the most fundamental questions that came out of some of your comments today is, you know, what is it that the community likes and doesn't like regarding the service delivery of the university police? And that's a great way to begin. Although police are not directly engaged in the primary purpose of UNM, which is to engage students, faculty, and staff in the comprehensive educational research and service programs, the UNMPD has been committed to ensuring a safe place for the campus community to learn and work and grow together, which has been our commitment for close to almost 100 years. And before that time, my understanding from our department historian, the military and possibly the New Mexico State Police provided some kind of public safety for our community. But campus policing is dramatically different than municipal policing. And officers are in a learning process as they work through the campus. You know, in campus policing, we spend most of our time serving the community. And with that in mind, I'd like to turn over the mic to Detective Tish Young, who will give an overview of the University of New Mexico Police Department.
Hi, let me, I have a presentation here I'd like to put up. Are you seeing it?
Did you hit share your screen at the green button at the bottom?
Okay, here we go.
There we go.
All right. Before I do the presentation, though, I would like to say that thank you for sharing all that stuff with us. I mean, that is stuff that we really appreciate hearing. I've been here 24 years, and when I started, the campus looked a lot different than it does now. It had the officers were able to be more on campus interacting with people. But over the years, our community has kind of been surrounded by an increase in crime. And that is one of the areas that we're looking at problem solving, because to keep up with that crime and to keep up with serving the community through community policing, we have to do things a little differently. Maybe not differently as police officers, but as a university, we have to look at different things that could help campus safety. One of the things that President Stokes has created since she's been here is the Campus Safety Council, and that I believe Dean Torres will speak more on that later, but I think that is a really great way to problem solve some of the things on campus that are happening that takes the burden off the police so we can do more community policing. Okay, so I will start the presentation to give you some information, background information on our police department, what our police do, what campus safety would look like without UNMPD, and what we can do better for the community.
Excuse me, do you mind clicking that slideshow button at the top so we can see it better?
Thank you.
Yeah.
I appreciate that. I'm not...
Keep going over. It's the top line. Yeah, there you go.
Okay.
And from beginning is, or yeah.
Okay, there we go. Okay, so we'll start just with some information on the hiring process. We have a very stringent hiring process. We go through many different phases of hiring, and it takes a long time, sometimes several months, just for the hiring process. We only consider the qualified candidates. We're very picky about the people that we hire, and we don't just look at, are they a good police officer? Do they have what it takes to be a police officer? We look at what kind of fit are they for the university? Are they good? Do they have good people skills? Are they able to communicate with our community? So we really look at two different things. We look at the skill set of a police officer, and we look at our environment and who we want here at UNM. One of the areas, one of the phases that we go through in the hiring process is our psychological testing. And that's one of the last things that someone will go through before they're hired. And even that phase is so stringent that 20% of the people that go through those pre-employment backgrounds in the psychological testing, they fail that part. So we're really screening hard. We're looking for people that we want to weed them out right from the beginning, make sure we're getting top quality people at our university. Our training also, it's ongoing training, but in the beginning, our basic police officer training is 675 hours. Our field training officer program can be 4 or more months for new people, less than that for officers that are lateraling into our department that are already certified and experienced. But that's not where it stops. We have biennium training that we have to take at least 40 hours of training to satisfy our certification so that we maintain our certification. We do forensic experiential trauma interview training, which is for sexual assaults. We also have sexual assault investigators in our department that have even more specialized training in handling sexual assault investigations. Plus we have all that university training. Also, every one of our officers goes through a 40-hour CIT training, which is the crisis intervention training, dealing with mental health issues, with crisis, well, obviously in the name of it, the crisis intervention, But that is a big part of our society now, and we want every one of our officers to be able to deal with those incidents that happen, because they happen frequently. We get university-specific training, and we're always looking for ways to advance our skill level, but not just that, to advance our understanding of the many different cultures here on campus. And in 2019, the officers had almost 2,000 hours of advanced training beyond what was required of them. And you know, the theory is that you are going to use less force. It's more probable that you will use less force if you are trained better. If you have those verbal skills, those verbal judo skills, if you have the CIT skills, if you have those skills, you're less likely to be in a use of force situation. You're going to be able to help that person without it escalating. So that's our goal, is to get our officers as much training as possible. Plus, we're in small departments, we don't have specialized units. Our officers do everything themselves from beginning to end. So right from the first interaction with someone all the way to court, those officers have to make sure that they are efficient in every area and maintain that efficiency. If they only do a drunk driving stop or a case of drunk driving once in a year, they have to make sure that they maintain that training throughout the year so that they don't forget any portion of that, because it's a very complicated area. So we look at the training of the officers in all those different areas to keep them up. This just shows our recruit officers and lateral officers and the difference. The recruit officers are inexperienced and have to go through all that initial training. They may not be solo officers for a year from the time we hire them. Where a lateral officer, we can get on the street several weeks after they're hired. But recruiting is an obstacle. And you know, that's something I won't go into a lot of details on, but recruiting has been an obstacle, especially in the current climate we have. A lot of people are choosing not to go into law enforcement as a career. Crime on campus, and this is something I already spoke to, we have had a huge increase of crime since I've been here. And with that brings more interactions. But luckily I would like to show you these stats. For the last 3 years, we've had 10 or 11 or less non-lethal uses of force. And in 2019, we had over 23,000 calls for service and only 10 non-lethal use of force. No deadly force was used. And the use of force can range from show of force, you know, pulling out your taser is also a use of force. Even if you don't use it, it's a show of force, all the way to hands-on to the use of a taser. No deadly force has been used. We're looking at 99.696% of all the calls for service we have no use of force at all. So that's pretty good when you look at that. And again, we train so that we don't have to use force. It's our last option. It's, you know, it's not something that we want to do. That is the last option for when we have to. We look at our use of force policy frequently. It was last updated almost a year ago. As far as hate crimes and racism go, Unmpd is identified as an intake center for Stop the Hate, which means that when we get a report of a hate crime or an issue of racism, we're going to make sure that we fully investigate that, give all the resources to the people involved, make sure there's follow-up. We're not going to let that slide. We're going to give it our full attention. We're also involved in the rapid response team for staff and faculty with the Division of Equity and Inclusion. We want to make sure that our department is part of any team that is doing that, is responding to any type of crimes that need that special attention. And the next slide is showing what campus would look like without police, without UNM police. So if we didn't have Unmpd on campus, we couldn't do traffic enforcement. We wouldn't be able to respond to panic or burglary alarms because we can't do that unarmed. We never know what we're going to run into. We wouldn't have the ability to arrest, so we're going to have to call other agencies in if we have a situation where an arrest needs to be made. There's going to be delayed response for emergency situations. The outside agencies, they're not going to be involved in our community like our police are. Our police are UNM staff. We're involved in our community. Our officers may take classes. Their kids might be students here. They have an investment in this campus, in this environment, and we care about the community. So outside agencies, they're not going to be as involved. They're not going to respond to, say, suspicious individuals walking through buildings. People get alerted to activities in the buildings and they call us for that. Outside agencies, they're going to prioritize. They're not going to respond to those calls. They're not going to respond to homeless individuals camping on campus. They're not going to follow up for misdemeanor crime investigations. So we do give specialized service to our community. Outside agencies, they're going to prioritize calls, and they're only going to they're going to respond, but the response is going to be not as quick as we can respond, not as knowledgeable. We know the campus, we know the areas, we know where the alarmed areas are. So we're looking at incidents that could happen on campus that our police with a quick response could solve a crime right there, where if a delayed response happens and the suspect is gone, you know, that crime may never be solved. So I don't really have time to give a lot of specific details of examples, but there are many examples that I could give you on how it benefits us greatly to have a police department here on campus. I'd like to tell you about a little bit more about the Campus Safety Council, and like I said, Dean Torres, I'm sure will be saying more to this. I'm going
to have to interrupt you because we're running over time.
Oh, okay.
So given that Dean Torres is going to talk about this, do you mind if we move
Okay, on? I will skip that. That's
okay.
Campus Safety Council. Okay, so community policing, this is really a big issue that we need to talk about, because community policing is something that builds trust within the community. We're looking at what problems or issues or concerns that our public sees that we may not have as much knowledge about, because we're dealing with what we're called to. So we need a lot of community support. We need a lot of interaction, and there's many ways we can do this. And with the Community Policing Committee, which Rob Burford and I myself chair, we're going to be looking at all the different things that we could do here on campus, get ideas, and start moving in those ways to connect with ethnic centers, to train with community members. Things that we have done throughout the years, we're always at the international student orientations, because we know that they're coming from all over the place. They have different experiences, their police do different things, and we want to have that conversation with them so that they understand what our police department is about and how they can come to us. This was an ethnic comparison that I did in November 2019 with the Albuquerque metro area. It was done in November of 2019, so it's changed a bit since then. We have lost approximately 10 officers since then. So it doesn't look like this, but we were right on target with our community as far as our ethnic comparison, our population goes with the UNM Police Department. And that's because we do hire within our community. We are part of our community. So we really need to continue doing that more within different areas, going out and recruiting people within our community, especially our student population, going out and talking to them about our police department and seeing, you know, getting people within our community interested in being part of our department. There's a whole bunch of stuff that UNM does really great for our community, and I won't go a whole lot into that. It's just, the point is that we care about UNM. We participate as staff, as students, as parents of students, as active members of the local community. We are police with special skills, and we are here to help our community, to serve our community, but we're also UNM staff. And we really need the support of our community in order to make things better. And now is a great time for change. Now is a really great time to talk about the different things we could do and how we could move forward. When campus reopens with our whole population, we want to be to a point where we're at full staff at the police department and we're able to dedicate people to those community members, to being out in the community and making them familiar with us as individuals, staff, as police, and what we can do for them as police officers. So that is the end of my presentation. I'll have lots more to talk about with community policing, but we can go to the next.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate that, Detective Young. It's amazing to see all that UNMPD has done over the past few years, and we're looking forward to collaborating with you all into the future. And so next I'd like to introduce Rob Burford, who is the UNM Compliance Officer, and he's going to talk a little bit about the realities of crime at UNM.
Good afternoon, everyone. As Asada said, my name is Rob Burford. I'm the Director of Compliance, which one of my roles is to deal with the Clery Act, or to handle the Clery Act. And what that role is to make sure we're transparent on what is reported to UNM as far as Clery Act crimes, and there's a number of those. And we can only report those that are reported to us. And I get that question quite frequently, is this all the reports? It's all the reports that have been officially reported to the university that have happened in our Clery geography, which there's different areas. That means it's basically happened on campus or at locations where we kind of control those entities. It could be some of our clinics off campus, the public property that surrounds the UNM campus. So that's my role, is to make sure we're transparent. And just to give you a quick update on one thing, I actually got asked from a community resource today about when our annual report's coming out. Because of COVID, we got that annual report extended to be sent out all universities across campus. Got this extension till the end of the year, so 12/31 of 20 is when our new annual report comes out. I know parents, our local media is always interested in doing that, because what that does is gives us the snapshot of what crimes have been reported. And I'll just go over a couple of what's reported. I'll give you the bad news first, but there's some good news embedded in that. When you look across some of the crimes, is our motor vehicle theft issue here in Albuquerque in general, but also at UNM. Unfortunately, UNM is tops with the motor vehicle theft, but we've made great strides in this area with our new president and the Campus Safety Council with our campus police. We've gone down over 60% from actually 2 years ago in motor vehicle theft. So that's, even though it's bad news that we're tops in the country, we've gone down over 60% in that area because we put a big focus, and that's where we get a black eye. And just, I'll give you a sample of another number. As far as burglaries, we had 50 that happened on campus, and this could be people, this is people taking things from other areas. But just to give you to help understand that, the university that had the most had 95. Another thing is people get on the Violence Against Women's Act crimes. Those are dating violence, domestic violence, and stalking. We report fondling cases that happen on campus, and we're going to have 14 that'll be reported for 2019. And the campus that will have the most, they had over 1,000 fondling cases. So that gives you kind of just a taste of what the different things are. Everything except for motor vehicle thefts is comparable to other campuses. I've been asked to try to do a comparison as far as enrollment. That's something I'm working on, but you'll see the annual report come at the end of the year, hopefully sooner than 12/31. So you can see the campus stats for 2019. And again, we're always a year behind because we get all the information typically during the spring and summer to put out on October 1st, but this year again, it'll be 12/31. I would have lots more to say, but I know we're running short on time, and I'd like to hand it back over to Asada so she can continue on with our next speakers.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate that, Rob, and appreciate how you keep track of our data. And, you know, that transparency is really important. And we were looking at some of the data in the Campus Safety Council a couple weeks ago, and Rob explained, you know, the data is reports. It's not investigations. It's not findings, it's reports, because we have to believe people. And so just that perspective, I think, is really important. So thank you for the fine work you're doing.
Just one quick thing to add, you're correct. It's just reports. And it's whether they happened or not, we have to, as you said, we have to take everyone, and we want to be transparent so we can put our resources into those areas. So we want people to report to us.
Thank you very much. Okay, and so we'll turn it back over to Chief Silva, who's going to talk a little bit about some of the current events that have happened over the summer on campus and ways that we collaborate with other law enforcement agencies, as well as use of force policies and institutional limitations. And I'll let you all know this is in response to many of the questions we've been receiving. So thank you so much for the heavy lift you're about to do.
Sure. So first I want to start by giving a little bit of background on the mutual aid agreements. And Dr. Zarai mentioned about how do the other law enforcement agencies work with us. And so we use the mutual aid agreements, and these agreements exist between agencies to provide assistance before, during, and after an emergency event like a natural disaster, hazmat situation. We have hazardous material on campus here, and we also have hazardous material going back and forth, either being transported or around Albuquerque. So we need to be aware of that. We're always vigilant for any terrorist attacks or active shooter events, which are unfortunately commonplace nowadays, or any other event or incident that could overwhelm the department's ability to respond. So these agreements, and you know, Detective Young mentioned earlier that, you know, we do have staffing issues. And so, you know, it's imperative that we do have these mutual aid agreements for incidences such as these. And these agreements facilitate the rapid mobilization of personnel, equipment, and supplies. And to give you a little bit more context on the issue with the tactical officers on the roof, and during the May 31st protest, I think it was publicized that there were gunshots during the protest. This was days before the sighting of the tactical officers on a rooftop. And there have been also nightly protests leading up to the protest where the tactical officers were observed on the rooftop of Pearl Harbor. And some of these protests led to significant property damage, and as I mentioned earlier, gunshots. So consequently, the state police positioned tactical officers on the rooftop after APD had informed the police in the area of the protests that there were armed subjects that had been spotted in the crowd. So the purpose of their position was to gather information from an overlooked position and identify any threats to the peaceful protesters. Now, just a little bit about what the officers were using. The officers used spotting scopes, which do resemble a rifle scope, but at no time would it be appropriate that the officers would ever scan the crowd with rifles. Tactically, when the rifles are set up on a tripod, they stay in that configuration unless needed. And I know that President Stokes received criticism for the forward observers, is what we classify the tactical officers as. And some have referred to them as snipers. But in this particular situation, I hope that I can effectively convey to you that all that the New Mexico State Police, first and foremost, had jurisdiction, especially being that this campus is on state land and is a state institution. The New Mexico State Police had the responsibility to provide overall safety to the peaceful protesters, and really therefore didn't need permission from us to provide tactical coverage. In other words, it's professional courtesy for them to let us know what's going on. But when they make the decision to respond, they also take the responsibility as well. So one of the questions, and there is a balancing act here. And so one of the questions held in balance during protests and social or civil unrest is, do we sacrifice safety and welfare of the community by not being proactive? There was a question about the rules of engagement, and that's typically a military term or used in a military context. So I really would need more information to what's behind the question on that. There was also a question of UNMPD's policy regarding the use of force. But before I specifically comment on the use of force policy, let me give you a little background of how our policies are developed. First, we put together a committee to review all the policies and identify which policies need to be updated, deleted, or created, and that is a process unto itself. Then we set up subcommittees to research the specifics within the identified policies, and we use best practices such as what is available at the International Association of Chiefs of Police Policy Resource Center. Now, once we draft or update a policy, we then have it reviewed by a former commissioner of the Commission on Accreditation for Law Enforcement Agencies, CALEA for short. And he reviews the policy specific with the gold standard of CALEA, which highlights 5 specific benefits to accreditation: increased community advocacy, stronger defense against civil lawsuits, staunch support of government officials, reduced risk of liability and exposure, and greater accountability with the agency. And, again, going back to some of our staffing challenges, although it would be a major undertaking and expense for UNMPD to become accredited, we still get the benefit of contrasting our policies with CALEA standards through our professional relationship with our consultant. Although there wasn't a specific question about our use of force policy other than mentioning it on the agenda, it's suffice to say that the process that I just described was used in updating this policy. However, specifically, our use of force policy uses the ruling from the Supreme Court that police use of force must be objectively reasonable, that an officer's actions were reasonable in light of the facts and circumstances confronting them, without regard to their underlying intent or motivation. It's a lot of words there, but basically what it means is that an officer must use only the force which is reasonable, prudent, that another officer would use under the same or similar circumstances. Now, some of the institutional limitations that we face day in and day out are staffing issues. Those are always challenges for us. Like Detective Young mentioned, we don't really have a lot of specialized units, so the officers are really doing policing in a generalist approach. So they kind of do everything, like Detective Young said, from beginning to end. And with that in mind, we do always are challenged with resources, not just staffing, but equipment, budgeting. One of the things that some of our visitors come and tell us is that, our building itself is, the front end of the building is a loading dock. And so they don't see it as a police department. And so that's a challenge from time to time. So that is a limitation that we have. Other than that, I wanted to make it as brief as I could. Hopefully I covered most of that. There's a lot there. I can tell you on each one of these things, I could spend a half an hour on each one, but in being conscious of time and so on and so forth, I just wanted to give a little bit, a tidbit of information. And like I said, there are some, and there were even some questions that definitely we would need background and dialogue, and that's, you know, that could be in a later time, but we would definitely welcome any dialogue with anything that we do.
Thank you so much, Chief Silva. Of course, this is the beginning of building a bridge and, you know, opening up those lines of communication. So not everything's going to be answered completely, but we're going to do our best in our short 25 minutes that we have left. And so now I'd like to turn it over to Kelly Davis, who's here representing the Staff Council. She works in the Dean of Students office, and the Staff Council worked hard to put a list of questions together, and she's going to ask some of those top questions now.
Thank you. Yes, Chief Silva and Detective Young, I have a few questions. The first is, how can UNM Police engage more with the UNM community and contribute to its educational mission?
I think one of the things that Detective Young brought up about the community policing effort that we've been involved in for the last couple of years, that's really a vehicle in which there can be dialogue and exchange and engagement in some of these things that we talked about earlier, and getting to know each other. And I think Armando talked about it's easier to discuss issues when you know the person. And so that's a perfect vehicle for that to happen. The other thing that, and I don't know how often it happens, but when I was in other professions, I was invited by some of the professors here to speak in some of their classrooms. I've been here for a while, and maybe it's, you know, partly my fault, but I don't know of any officers that have been asked by professors to come and speak to their classes. So that would be, oh, Tish is always kids. But anyway, that would be something that we would definitely look forward to, and there's officers that would be more than welcome to visit the classrooms and participate in building those educational blocks throughout each semester.
Thank you so much. We'll ask you, Kelly, to ask your favorite of the last two questions since we're running behind time.
Sounds good. What do you suggest for next steps for improving UNMPD and Black, Indigenous, and persons of color relationships here on our campus?
Okay, if I could answer. All right. So with our community policing, before the COVID happened, we were trying to put together something that we would have better relationship building with the ethnic groups in Mesa Vista Hall, going to training for safe zone training with Frankie for LGBTQ, which we're still working on, but making ourselves familiar, being available to talk with them, answer questions. I think that is one thing we can do, but we want them to invite us when they feel comfortable too, because us kind of inviting ourselves over to get to know them doesn't always work well. We gotta have someone meet us in the middle and say, hey, we're planning this event. Do you think, you know, you would want to be involved in this? We don't want to force ourselves on people that may be uncomfortable with our presence. So we have to ease into it and really make people feel comfortable by just talking about our department, about the campus, about, you know, whatever people want to talk about as far as safety on campus goes. I really think it's important that we are out there interacting with our public all the time, all areas of our public.
Thank you so much. We appreciate that and all the good work you're doing. One thing I'll say is that when we were putting this together, everyone said that they wanted Detective Tish to be a part of it. So we appreciate your connection to the communities and all of your fine work. And so now we're going to move on to our final panel, looking at feasibility and institutional accountability. And we will start off with the Dean of Students, Nasha Torres.
Hi, thank you for having me. As Dr. Zarai said, I'm Nasha Torres, the Dean of Students. I co-chair the Campus Safety Council with Detective Tish Young. The Campus Safety Council was something that was created by President Stokes because, as she mentioned in her opening comments, campus safety was a top priority for her. And she asked Detective Young and I to look at what kinds of committees are already on campus that are working on safety issues, and what kinds of things could we do to increase communication between those groups and identify any places where we might need to work more. And in that work, we discovered there already was a lot happening on campus to address campus safety issues. It's just they may not have been working together as well as they probably could have. So we have the SMART team, which works on sexual misconduct. We have a security operations task force, which works on things like cameras and lights, things like that. We have a threat assessment and care team, which works on behavior intervention. And we had a facilities management steering committee. And after Tish and I looked at that, we thought, what else? Well, we started looking at policies. We started looking at community policing and how to increase that, training and prevention, working on areas that have high student concentration. And we thought the best way to approach this would be to have a multidisciplinary team of all the people on our campus that touch and work on campus safety. Emergency management, UNmpd, the Dean of Students Office, the Division of Equity and Inclusion, Facilities Management, the President's Office, UNMH Security, UNM HSC, because what happens on one side of campus affects the other and vice versa, and students through GPSA and ASUNM, Staff Council, and Faculty Senate. In our first year, which was just last year, Detective Young and I, pre-coronavirus, met with as many students as we possibly could, as many staff as we possibly could. We hosted a lot of focus groups to hear from students and other people what their primary concerns were. It helped us identify some things we need to work on. It helps us make some recommendations to the president, and I think we still have a lot more work to do. To learn more about the Campus Safety Council and campus safety efforts, you can go to campussafetyunm.edu. And that's it. That's my 3-minute spiel.
Good job. Thank you. I'm very proud at this point. So I would like to introduce Francie Cordova, who is our Director of the Office of Equal Opportunity.
Thank you, Dr. Sarai. And I know the next topic we were looking at is reporting. If someone wants to report an interaction with an officer on campus or virtually anything else, where do they report this? And there's a lot of reporting possibilities on campus, but I think the easiest and the cleanest way for people to report is using our UNM Ethics Point hotline reporting system. And that's at unm.ethicspoint.com or at 888-899-6092, which you won't remember, but we're gonna put this information out so you can have this access. This reporting site is something that is a universal reporting site. It can be used by faculty, staff, students, or the public. You can report anonymously, and your report will not go directly to the police if it's about the police, or to us if it's about OYO, whatever that is. It'll go to someone else above that so that they can look at it for whatever element they're looking at. I think that's the easiest way, and it's the best way for us to be able to look at complaints and see if there's any trends, anything like that we can identify. We meet regularly, so I'm also the Interim Chief Compliance Officer for the university, and we meet regularly with all the heads of various departments to let them know, hey, you have 4 complaints coming in about this person or this topic. Maybe we should look at mitigation or some things that we can do. So I think that's the best way to report in the cleanest way. We also have a hate bias reporting system, and we've just change that a little bit so it doesn't go directly to the police anymore. It'll go only to OEO. Then we'll contact the person and ask them, do you want this to go to the police? And if they do, then we'll send it to the police to have them look at it for a hate crime or any other crime that the people report. So that's for reporting. And then I know we have a couple more topics in very little time. Dr. Sarai, would you like me to pass it on to SVP Castandidas to talk about the police chief search?
Thank you so much, Francie, and thank you, Dr. Zarai. So I'm Teresa Constantinides, the Senior Vice President for Finance Administration, and I just want to give folks an update on our search for a new police chief. So on June 30th, the former UNMPD police chief, Kevin McCabe, retired, and we appointed an interim police chief, Joe Silva, who's been speaking to you today. We have not yet actually launched that search for a permanent replacement chief because President Stokes said that we really need to make sure to gather broad input both before and then during the search process. And I have to say this town hall has been a wonderful source of input that we will listen to and think about carefully. So I do expect to begin the formal search process soon. And I promise you all that we will make sure the search itself has broad input, broad community input, including when we get to the point where we identify finalists from the position. We really want to listen to our community to make sure we have the best person for the position. Thank you. So with that, I'm actually going to then turn it to Chief Silva, who's going to be talking about classes. Joe. Oh, and your son. There we go.
I didn't pick up what you said I would be speaking about.
So in terms of the commitment of UNPD to taking classes to basically unlearn and lessen the impact of the biases, the trauma that we heard about earlier in the presentation.
Sure. So, you know, my vision for the police department, and it's actually been that since I began, was to transform the University of Mexico Police Department into a learning organization. And, you know, one of the things, I've been a lifelong trainer. I've been an official law enforcement trainer since 1983. And so I've experienced a lot of different things. And, you know, one of the things that I think that Frankie brought up earlier in opening, which I thought was, you know, a revelation for me as a trainer, because I travel around the country, and I think in most police academies, they don't talk about policing beginning with slave patrols. They talk about the modern policing through Sir Robert Peel. And so I think even just having that awareness and that dialogue of how people of color can be impacted by the understanding and scholarly work that I think it was Dr. Gary Potter that did a lot of work with the slave patrols and the beginning of policing. That gives a different perspective to folks, and especially police. And so we're definitely committed to developing officers' competencies. I can tell you that the governor impaneled a group that are going to be looking at racism statewide, and they're supposed to have their recommendations to her, I think, in November. And so to talk about a little bit about training, all the law enforcement officers in the state of New Mexico are certified through the Law Enforcement Academy. And that's where the 640 some hours begin. And then they mandate biennium training, and that's by statute. So we have to meet those training obligations, and they can cover a myriad of different things. The Law Enforcement Academy has a board made up of citizens and police, and they identify those areas of training that need to be done for our state. I suspect that the findings of this commission that the governor put together, that some of those things, because there is a law enforcement component in that, I suspect that those things are going to be forwarded to the Law Enforcement Academy board. But in short, as long as I'm here at the University of New Mexico, I'm definitely committed to educating our officers and developing their competencies so they can better serve our community.
Thank you so much for that. There are a couple of questions in the chat which I think could be answered pretty easily. So Tish, there's a question about the diversity distribution of UNMPD, and I know that that is in one of the versions of your presentation. Do you want to just respond to that?
Did you say the female gender officers?
Gender and race.
Okay, so right now we're really lacking with our female officers. We need to look at that, but that's not something we can, we hire by ability and by people that are interested in our department. So we really have to do a better job in recruiting in the areas that we're interested in, but we really need female officers. I think the key is to go out and talk with the different groups on campus and different groups in the area to get them to want to be a part of our department, showing, you know, that our department does good things for our community. We want to serve in the best way possible, and we want people to, you know, be part of our staff and appreciate the community like we do. I think it's key that we go out and we recruit in a very broad manner.
Thank you very much. Were there any of the other questions that we put in the chat to you and Chief Silva that you would like to respond to?
Actually, right now, I would like to say that we don't have enough officers to do the things that we want to do. We are actively hiring. We're getting in fact, we had an officer start this week. We've got a couple that are starting very soon, but it takes a while to train the officers, to get them on the street. So hopefully we'll get to a full staff before the rest of the UNM community gets back, and we can go and do those extra things, do, you know, above and beyond what we have to do to really fit into the community and do what we really want to do.
Thank you so much. Here's another question. Have we considered community and volunteer-based safety measures, which would be made up of unarmed volunteers trained in conflict mediation and make people feel welcome to our campus? I know this is something that Dean Torres has talked about a little bit.
Yeah, so yeah, we have talked in the Campus Safety Council about it and the police department. We're throwing around ideas of how we can get students more involved in our department. We used to have student employees that did walking escorts around campus. I'd love to see something like that back. There's different groups on campus that would do community service to help the police department, but we really need to find those groups and get them involved in our community policing committee and get those things started.
So I have a little bit of praise here from, you never see that in the chat, so let's all celebrate. This is a comment saying, is Chief Silva a good fit? Looks that way. And so just wanted to see if you had any other comments to make, Chief Silva, and then we'll turn it on over to SVP Constantinides.
Sure. One of the things I saw in the chat is about a good fit. And, you know, we go through a Chiefs board, and I think Detective Young talked about that. And we could be, you know, halfway to our staffing goals right now if we had just hired whoever we wanted to that was available. But we are very selective. Deputy Chief Christine Chester has been doing recruiting for many, many years, and she knows how to spot problems and issues of officers. Sometimes they call them gypsy cops. And so what we do when, to answer the question, is it a good fit? We look at the values of the university, and we look at the history of the police officer and say, does this police officer demonstrate anything within their time as a law enforcement officer that would be a good fit for the university? And if the answer is no, then we pass on them.
Thank you so much. We'll have our final words from SVP Constantinides.
Thank you so much, Dr. Zarai. And I want to start with some thanks to thank everyone for participating in this town hall, especially those of you who submitted many, many questions in advance and also submitted during the Q&A during the town hall. To the panelists for all of your work and your passion for campus safety, and of course to our president for leading the charge and saying that this is important. Policing is an important issue, I think, for all of us, and we in UNM leadership really need to hear from our community and understand your thoughts and input. Our officers, our police staff, they all had this goal of actively protecting the people and the university and also preserving our human rights. It's an important job, but it's important that the members of our police department also have this cooperative relationship with the members of our community. And we've heard today from Director Agoyo, for example, that the community really feels this chasm that is formed between our police department and the members of the community. Folks feel separate from the police. We hear you want closer connections. And in some cases we hear we don't see this way to have a more authentic relationship. I'm going to quote Armando, who said, "It really is up to us collectively together to shift that view." And I really think we can do it. Our collective goal needs to be to work together to build stronger bridges between UNMPD and the rest of the campus community. I think an event like this town hall today will help be responsive and help us do that, but we all need to work on this together to achieve these goals. Thank you, Dr. Sarai. Thank you, everyone, so much. I really appreciate the time and effort and thought that has gone into this town hall.
Thank you so much. Any final words? We have 4 minutes. Somehow that happened. Any final words from anyone else? President Stokes, would you like to say some final words?
No, I'll just add and really echo what Teresa has said, which is, deeply appreciate the conversation today. I think we are all going to have things to think about that we heard today and read, in the questions and answers and in the chat, but really appreciate the thoughtfulness of everyone who's participated in this panel. And I do see this as the beginning of really improving what we do as a university in serving our entire campus community. So thanks so much.
Thank you, and thank you to all the panelists for the time that you spent preparing for today and for all of the good work that you've been doing for many months and years to make our campus a safer place and a more welcoming place. And so for all of you, what we're planning to do is to put this recording on the DEI website along with all of the questions and all of the answers. And so you will have that as an archive. Also, please make sure you take a look at the Campus Safety Council website for another source of excellent information. And with that, we will finish 2 minutes early. All right, thanks everyone. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.